Hi, I want to speak to you today about some of my research about the relationships between inequality and human rights, in particular, how these questions of economic inequality have been taken up within institutional debates around human rights at the United Nations over the last 50 years or so. Before I start, I want to say a big thank you to Ano, Shamisha, Ilan, and Christine for facilitating this online lecture series. I think it's a great way for us to stay connected in these unsettling times. And I also want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and that their sovereignty over this land that we now call Melbourne, Australia, has never been ceded. And particularly when we speak about questions of economic inequality and questions of human rights, I think it's really important to foreground these questions of Indigenous justice and Indigenous sovereignty, which continue to be very unsettled questions requiring responses of justice in so-called Australia. So, like I said, I want to speak about how these questions of economic inequality have been taken up in institutional debates around human rights at the UN, and I think we're all quite familiar now with these sort of newspaper headlines. It seems like every year we get another report that tells us the inequality gap, which was already horrendously wide, has become even more shockingly wide. But we know that, it's a number of people now hold more wealth than half the world's population, and that these figures have been gaining attention and becoming a big part of the debate, particularly since the 2008 economic crisis, then the sort of Occupy movement, and now with COVID-19 too, we're seeing again how it's increasing these inequalities that have already been such a persistent and present feature of the global political economy. And so, even though in the contemporary era human rights become one of the key frameworks by which people have made social justice claims, human rights scholars, practitioners, and advocates for a long time didn't really have that much to say about the questions of economic inequality. In 2015, as part of his mandate as Special Rapporteur for Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, Philip Olsson prepared a report for the Human Rights Council focused on the relationship between poverty and extreme inequality, in which he argued that human rights frameworks are critical for addressing extreme inequality. And throughout the rest of his mandate, he really took up these questions of inequality, focusing also on inequality in the US, in the UK, and other countries that he visited as part of that mandate. And this then sparked a big debate sort of within human rights fields, and this debate online on open democracy is one example of that. And sort of a question that kept being posed is sort of what explains this comparative silence of the human rights community on a trend that poses such a critical challenge to the realisation of a full range of human rights? What blind spots do human rights practitioners need to confront, both normative and conceptual, as well as strategic and methodological, in order to effectively confront these blind spots and sort of ask critical questions about, whether, how human rights can respond to this question of economic inequality. And I got a little bit frustrated with some of these questions because I felt that distributive questions, questions of global justice, questions of distributive justice have been really central to engagements with people from scholars, activists, practitioners from the global south with human rights from sort of the decolonisation era onwards. And that's why I then chose to embark on a historical project looking at how sort of this question of economic inequality, like I said, was taken up within the institutional debates at the UN. And in doing so, I was very much engaged with a really live debate that other scholars were also engaging with. So some notable work in this sort of space is obviously Sam Moyen's very influential book, Human Rights in an Unequal World, in which he sort of argues that human rights have operated as a powerless companion to neoliberalism, that instead of that they've been incapable of really dismantling the sort of the relations of inequality, rather that human rights have focused on minimum provision and sufficiency, and that this has made them unthreatening to the sort of in the neoliberal moment, particularly when what we're seeing is sort of the obliteration of a ceiling, where you see vast amounts of accumulation, and that in this space, human rights is just focused on this question of sufficiency and minimal rights and protections. Similarly, you've also got other thinkers, particularly those working in a more sort of Marxist or third world tradition, have sought to highlight the convergences and compatibilities between human rights and neoliberalism. Probably most influentially, Jess White, in her brilliant work, has shown how the language of human rights was used to challenge the vision of substantive equality that was integral to the third worldist demands for a new international economic order. And she therefore rejects sort of these mainstream characterizations of human rights NGOs as ineffectual or powerless, and instead indicts them as active, enthusiastic, and influential fellow travellers of the neoliberal project, and shows how there's been a formulation of a distinctly neoliberal rights discourse facilitated and legitimated, and that facilitated and legitimated, the dismantling of a redistributive idea of the state, and then instead provided the competitive market with a moral language to legitimate itself. And so what I found was helpful in terms of focusing on these sort of institutional UN debates, which is very limited in some ways because it doesn't really engage with the same sort of intellectual, historical debates that both Moyne and White have engaged so brilliantly. And it also doesn't really deal with the questions of social movements and how human rights have been taken up in different places by activists as well, in ways that may probably push those institutional frameworks. But what I have found helpful about the approach that I've taken is that it shows how in different periods of time they're quite divergent engagement with and responses to the problem of economic equality in human rights debates. And so we really focus on what it is about specific moments, what are those enabling conditions that allow for a more critical engagement with the relationship with how human rights might take up the question of economic inequality. And I found too that, these debates really reflect the broader political economy of the period. So in periods like the 1970s, that I'll get to in a minute, where you've got a broader questioning of global frameworks, legal frameworks, economic frameworks, political frameworks, you again see a much more critical discourse around human rights and economic inequality. And this slowly narrows and gets much thinner as there's less space for those sort of broader critical debates. The other thing that my research has shown is that some of the stakes about in these debates about how human rights should respond to economic inequality is also different visions or understandings of human rights and how they should be conceptualized. And particularly, it makes it really clear that there's a real tension between a sort of contemporary conception of human rights as an internationally authorized individual claim against the nation state, and a different conception of human rights as enabled and realized through the nation state that requires a just international economic order as the precondition for its realization. So I'll quickly talk through sort of some of this historical story that I've found fascinating to try and sort of uncover. And I started with the first International Human Rights Conference in Tehran in 1986. So the Tehran Proclamation that came out of that conference clearly identified economic inequality as a problem for the realization of human rights, stating the widening gap between the economically developed and developing countries impedes the realization of human rights in the international community. And this was really taken up at the time. So in a 1981 report, Philip Olsson describes the Tehran Conference as sowing the seeds for what he called a structural phase in UN human rights action and catalysing what he calls, and I quote, a growing awareness that it is at least as important to identify and seek to remove structural obstacles that lie at the root of many an injustice as it is to deal with their symptoms in the form of particular violations. So he describes this more structural approach to human rights as, and again I quote, emphasising a preventative rather than curative strategy for improving enjoyment of human rights. And this sort of what I call a more structural engagement with the relationship between human rights and economic inequality arguably reached its apex then in the General Assembly Resolution 32-130 of 1971. And then other scholars, such as Teresa Gonzalez, suggest that this was representative of, and I quote, an independent third world movement to reorientate the UN Human Rights Programme that was evolving since the 1960s. So again, you see that influence of third world engagements in these spaces. And so it's not surprising that we see this engagement in the 1970s, because it's a critical period for discussions on economic inequality. Particularly, third world demands for a new international economic order dominated discussions in this period that made clear that connections between global inequalities between countries, the relationship between democracy, neocolonialism, and the need for structural change of international law and of the international political economy. However, it's also a decade in which, as time went on, there was increased attention being paid to growing economic inequalities, not just between countries, but also within countries, and particularly within third world states, by international development organisations and others. So one prominent example of this is the World Bank President McNamara 1993 Nairobi speech, where he focuses on inequality within countries. And then this attention to inequality within countries really gets directed towards the promotion of basic needs and extended international intervention by development institutions in particular in these third world states in the name of poverty alleviation. And so in some ways it becomes a neutralisation of the much more critical structural account of inequality that was also being provided at the time. So just before the Tehran Conference at the 24th session of the Commission of Human Rights, it called for a study on the question of the realisation of economic, social and cultural rights, and appointed Iranian lawyer Mansour Ganzi to prepare this report. So his initial report was called The Widening Gap, presented to the Commission in 1973, and highlighted both inequalities within and between countries. And a whole section of this report addressed the international dimensions of the obstacles to and the possibilities for the realisation of economic, social and cultural rights in the less developed countries due to relations of dependency and lopsided development. So it's a critique of how the problem of the realisation of economic, social and cultural rights, particularly in the third world, was being constrained and limited by these unequal relations of continuing neocolonialism, unequal development, etc. And then this was the final report then published later. So these ideas were then taken up in some of the resolutions of the committee. So for example, you've got resolutions where the Commission expresses concern about the increased disparity of living conditions and income levels between the developed and the developing countries, and articulates that it's the duty of the international community to contribute to putting an end to this disparity. And as I mentioned before, I think the culmination of these debates is the General Assembly Resolution 32-130 from 1997, which reiterated the indivisibility of all human rights, and then, as some have argued, inscribed the logic of the NIEO in the Human Rights Programme by affirming that the realisation of a new international economic order is an essential element for the effective protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms. So there's been a lot of criticism by some human rights scholars of this more structural focus, who were concerned that it risks sidelining individual concerns. So both Olsson and Donnelly saw the Ganji report and this 77 resolution as emblematic of, and I quote, the evolution of human rights goals and priorities of the UN during the 70s. Again, others have been concerned that this structural account then was deployed quite cynically by states and worked to efface injustices in the particular by instead promising this nebulous promise of structural revolution that's concentrated in state hands. And these are important critiques. However, I think what remains valuable to focus on is that articulation of the need to address international inequalities and the injustice of the international order, and to understand that as a precondition for the realisation of economic, social rights. And what I think is particularly interesting is how some of the work on how this was taken up in some of the discussions on the right to development. So this right was, as we know, proposed by Senegalese Juris Membe in 1972, recognised by the Commission in 1997 in the context of calling for a further study. and then at an expert meeting that was hosted by UNESCO in 1978, you have a debate about human rights, human needs, and the new international economic order. And I think here you see a real trying to bring together these concerns about both structural conditions and individual rights. So, and the workshop report notes that international social justice in the sense of the new international economic order might be neither a necessary nor sufficient condition for international social justice in the sense of basic needs. They're saying it's a necessary condition, but it's not enough. We need more. And so they sort of talked instead about the need to break the framework which continually generates the conditions that are the antithesis of those in which people could enjoy their rights, and that we need to struggle against these structures. But they also noted the elitist nature of some of the NIEO proposals, and especially the risk that these proposals could be used to reinforce the position of elite groups throughout the world by confining itself to a redistribution of privileges amongst existing dominant groups. So they called for, really, a total change in both inter and international power structures, and that such a change must surpass just the economic sphere. And so I think this sort of engagement, we see both a concern of structural, but also, the concern about individual rights in a context of elite power within the state, gives us a sense of how we can nuance these arguments a little bit further. And particularly what I think is interesting too is that these developments are often forgotten in sort of the current historiography of human rights, which really is focused on the 1970s as sort of this breakthrough moment for human rights. But this sort of account of the breakthrough of human rights in the 1970s really focuses on the rise of a very US-centric, very civil and political rights as an idea that then globalizes around the world. And I think putting it in this context helps us recognize that really what is at stake here is the prioritization and reclamation of a very specific vision of individual and political civil rights at that moment, and the marginalization of a more alternative, more distributive conception of human rights. And so instead, we see the globalization of this idea of civil and political rights, but at the same time we're seeing this sort of marginalization of a more these other potential understandings of human rights that saw a just international economic order, redistributive justice as necessary preconditions for the realization of rights. So during the 1980s then you see how, particularly in debates in the West, economic and social rights were marginalized, and advocates were constantly having to defend the status of these rights as rights. And I sought to trace again some of the key debates in the 1980s, foregrounding sort of a different approach to the realization of how advocates and practitioners sort of tried to formulate a different approach to the realization of economic, social, and cultural rights that's much more focused on minimal rights and sufficiency, which again also sidelined a more critical engagement with questions about the necessary international economic and social conditions for rights realization that we saw was the focus in the 1970s. And so this thought collective of sort of human rights practitioners and advocates really drew on this literature around basic needs, approach to development policy in the 1970s. You see, the influence of people like Henry Hsu, Amartya Sen, and his capacities approach as well. And sort of particularly some of the work of Aswan Aidi on the right to food, I think, is really critical in this regard of formulating a different way in which we think about the realization of economic, social, and cultural rights, much more focused on sort of this basic minimal core. By the end of the 1980s, when economic and social rights practitioners and scholars attended a seminar on human rights and the disadvantaged, they were counselled by Aidi about the necessity of accepting, and I quote, a pragmatic compromise between the ideal and the realistic. So it made a call for rights advocates to retreat from an ideal that might call for equality for all, and instead focus on the pragmatic realisation of rights through constant vigilance to improve the conditions for the most vulnerable, without expecting abrupt and dramatic transformations of comprehensive and interlocking economic and social systems. So he advocated this approach in order to avoid what was perceived to be an unwinnable fight with, and I quote, the powerful and aggressive who continue to fight for their privileges. And so I think it's quite telling to look at this, and what's really problematic in this formulation, I think, is not just the astonishing minimalism of what was hoped for by these human rights advocates, but also the assumption that underpins this, that in order to translate economic and social rights claims into implementable and realisable entitlements, it was necessary to appeal to the powerful rather than to contest the unequal distribution of power. So embedded in this sort of position that ID puts out, which I think sort of really becomes emblematic of human rights in this period, are assumptions about the processes through which rights are realised, and assumptions that explain really important things about the sort of orientation, strategies and tactics of human rights activism, particularly in the West as it was then taken up. And we see then too how this sort of focus on minimal core obligations is sort of taken up in general comment number 3 by the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights in 1990. So then the aftermath of the Cold War sort of was sort of a period from the early 1990s onwards where, despite optimism about renewed international cooperation, there were also really strong anxieties about growing global inequalities and intractable third world debt. So it was also a period that saw a flurry of activity in the human rights field, especially around the 1993 Human Rights Conference in Vienna. But again, civil and political rights remain the main focus in the field. But despite that, we see some of these reports that I'll point to by the Subcommission on the Prevention of Discrimination and Protection of Minorities explicitly address this question again of economic inequality and how human rights could or should respond. So you see in a 1992 report by Danilo Turk, canvassed growing income inequality between states and the underlying dynamics that was driving it, especially sort of focusing on these structural things such as third world debt, the imposition of structural adjustment programs through conditionalities from the World Bank and the IMF. But at the same time, his report was also provided a scathing critique of socialist approaches to equality and the promotion, and really promoted this liberal idea of equality as non-discrimination. So although he spends a whole section of his report analysing the problem of growing income distribution and explicitly acknowledges that growing income disparities threaten the realisation of economic, social and cultural rights, he nonetheless warns against policies to pursue unqualified egalitarianism. Moreover, although he stresses that economic growth alone is insufficient for rights realisation, the formulation he develops is one in which economic growth is posited as an unquestionable imperative, whilst redistribution is only seen as a desirable discretionary approach. So I think, this really sets a stage for how these sort of debates throughout the 1990s on human rights and inequality develop. You had this very sort of a liberal conception of inequality as sort of non-discrimination and equity, but sort of a move away again from a much recognition of the structural forces driving it, but a move away from a much more political engagement and approach. So there's recognition of the need for further studies. Asborn Eadie was commissioned to write a report as well, which was submitted in 1994. His report concluded there was no doubt that trends towards wealth concentration, and I quote, constitute a serious obstacle to the realisation of human rights, particularly economic and social rights. However, throughout his report, Eadie moves to reframe the problem from one of equality of outcome to equality of opportunity. And it's the latter, equality of opportunity, that is his primary concern, and he warns about the efficiency of costs that trying to address equality of outcome would have. So again, you see this sort of a very liberal, arguably neoliberal idea of inequality and how it's conceptualized sort of being promoted through these UN reports. Thereafter, the subcommission mandated Jose Bengoa to produce a series of reports on the relationship between human rights and income distribution, and he acknowledges again too that, and I quote, inequitable income distribution is at present becoming the main threat to world peace, political stability amongst nations, and the maintenance of social life. and also that inequality between nations always goes hand in hand with a denial of basic human rights. However, despite this, he takes up and further extends that distinction that Idy had made between inequality of outcome and inequality of opportunity, arguing that a modern view of the economic, social, and cultural rights of individuals should have as its focal point the right to opportunity. So the late 1990s have been described by scholars as a period of chastened neoliberalism, where you see sort of development policies and prescriptions of the international financial institutions that have been pushing a lot of this structural adjustment that was driving increased global inequality, increasingly took greater account of human rights and social concerns, epitomised in the World Bank's 1997 Comprehensive Development Framework. However, at the same time, I argue that what you see here, particularly in these reports that I've been highlighting, a gradual narrowing and neoliberalisation of human rights discourse over the same period. Particularly this focus on equality of opportunity for individuals to develop their capacities to participate in global markets. And this is really an approach that fails to contest the drivers of economic inequality and the ways in which the institutional legal structures of global markets themselves are producing these inequalities. So we then see sort of a greater and easy convergence between human rights and development agendas reflected in the Millennium Development Goals put forward at the turn of the millennium. But again, these have had their primary focus on reducing absolute poverty, not so much inequality. And then you see a real take-up of these concerns around poverty and human rights in this period. And I think this really reflects a depoliticised approach to poverty reduction that avoided the pointy structural questions and the reality of growing inequality. In 2015, we have sort of the Sustainable Development Goals being formulated, and they do include a goal to reduce inequality within and between countries. However, they really continue to be based on this sort of problematic, ahistorical, non-relational understanding of poverty and development that's closely related to sort of neoliberal policy approaches to development, with a real focus on access to the market rather than a sort of understanding of how markets are constructed in ways that produce inequalities. So I think this history then provides a really useful standpoint at which to look at current debates. And particularly, I think it's really telling if we look at Philip Olsson's 2015 report on economic inequality, and as welcome as that was in terms of raising these questions, the primary focus of that report was not inequality per se, but extreme inequality, which is never really quite defined. And similarly, he does not promote a right to equality, but right to equality of opportunity. So you see again how this is very much influenced by these developments over the last 20 years, 30 years. And so, like I said, I'm really concerned that this concern of inequality of opportunity, even though it's critical, deflects necessary attention from the structure and ordering of international markets and global value chains and the underlying sort of background legal rules that structure both national and international economies and how these might be generative of inequality. So therefore, in that way, current human rights discussions, compared to those from the 1970s, for example, avoid engaging with these sort of more structural questions of unequal exchange and the ways in which unequal exchange is embedded in the institutional structures of society. So to wrap up, what does this sort of all tell us? In some ways, this sort of historical analysis has avoided engaging with the really pointy questions of whether human rights can or should address the question of economic inequality, which I think is really a practical, strategic, rather than a normative or analytical position, whether we should be adopting a pragmatism refusal and developing other vocabularies for justice around redistributive justice rather than human rights. And I'm really sympathetic to that view, but also maintain that the way in which human rights talks about economic inequality could be much broader than it currently is. And I think this history really highlights that the way in which human rights has sought to respond to problems of economic inequality brings to the fore these competing perspectives on the meaning and nature of human rights, particularly a tension between the sort of like I said, an idea of human rights as an internationally authorised individual claim against the nation state, and a different conception of rights as embodied in, realised through the state, that requires as its precondition a just international economic order. And in that way, it suggests the need for a history that's attentive to different traditions of human rights and how they were shaped, rather than human rights as sort of a singular conceptual project or aspiration. However, I think this sort of account also shows how any discussion about the political potentialities of rights really needs to be attentive to how such possibilities are always already subject to systemic constraints, including of the very form and structure that rights take. And also that there's a real danger in sort of accounts that sort of treat human rights as sort of free-floating, disconnected from the structures of contemporary capitalism and unmoored from the historical conditions in which they're being sought to be mobilised and realised. And that any really account of the redistributive possibilities of human rights needs to be attentive to the historical, political and economic conditions in which rights frameworks function. And to the limited extent to which we've seen, maybe a more opening of the ways in which human rights have talked about economic inequality, redistributive justice at various moments in time, particularly in the sort of 1970s. I think this is arguably reflective of that historical context and the extent to which a much broader critique of the inequalities of the global political economy was being advanced at that particular moment, and that human rights is sort of just reflective of those much more broader critical discussions around what it would take to realise a more equitable international, global, economic, political and legal order. Thank you very much for listening. I hope that's given some food for thought, and I look forward to any comments or reflections that people have.